Okay, everybody, welcome to this CMD webinar hosted by Baptist ministers in the UK Facebook group. For those who don't know, Jonathan and I are both two of the admins of that group, and Jonathan is actually hosting and leading today's, or facilitating, I probably ought to say, today's conversation. These are monthly. They're usually on the first Thursday of the month. This one's slightly different, but they run through the year. And if you look on either of the Facebook pages, Baptist Ministers in the UK or Baptist Ministers Network, eventually when I get round to it, there will be a program of forthcoming seminars. But just to whet your appetite, next month in March, we've got Martin Hogden talking about friendship as a means of inclusion and disability justice. April, we've got Mark Elder talking about maintaining theological engagement in ministry, and so on and so forth. Do keep an eye open. They're really well worth going. We've had some fantastic ones back last year that really, really helped me. So I'm going to pray for Jonathan and then hand over to him. He's talking about building healthy and good networks and relations between churches. So let's just pray together, shall we? Father, we recognize that in John's Gospel, one of your deepest prayers when you were wrestling was that the people of God would be one. And we just pray that this morning's webinar helps us to both maintain and build good relations between our church and other churches. Thank you for Jonathan, for the preparation he's put in and the experience and expertise he's gathered over the years. Help us to both teach one another and learn from one another this morning. Amen. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, David. Appreciate that. Well, it's great to be able to share with you. What will be good to do at the start, I think, is for us just to hear from each other in a moment. So there's your warning. I'm going to come to you and I'm going to ask you just to share who you are, where you are, and a bit of your experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly of being in networks. Maybe not a 10-minute message, but it doesn't have to be 2 sentences. So I'd love to know why you signed up today. And it would be good to hear from you. So that gives you a warning as I share that I'm going to be coming to you eventually to get you to share as well and just to kind of introduce ourselves. So I'm Jonathan and I am currently the minister at in Northeast London in a church called Woodford Baptist Church. My family and I, we've been here for 3 years this week. This week marks 3 years of my induction here. Loving it, and strange season like everybody's had because of pandemic. We had that. We were here for a year and got that. Those of you who moved around a bit will know, end of year 1, there's that expectation. Well, you've been here a year now. You got a clear sense of where we're at. What's next for us? And of course, what was next for us was to shut the doors and to move online and do all of that stuff. So a strange few years. But prior to that, I was in Wolverhampton, and it's going to be reflecting on that experience and an experience earlier I had when I was in Northampton of networks that I was part of and that I led. And in Wolverhampton, that included being part of something that was called Connect Wolverhampton, which was a network of some 60 churches and church leaders that I was one of the leaders of, that drew together people from right across the city, from loads of different backgrounds and traditions and ministers from those churches, in a really powerful way that I think released something of God's kingdom. And I've also been part of other networks, especially in Northampton. I founded something called the FaithWorks Northampton Network. I founded that there, then became something else after I'd left the town. And again, that was a network of some 25, 30 churches from lots of different backgrounds working together in social action projects. So that's kind of the background that I bring. It's something that I've been passionate about. And so drawing people together from different churches and finding ways of serving God together and doing life together have been a key part of what I've been about. As David has said, along with David, Sarah Bingham and Alice McDermott, we administer the Baptist Ministers in the UK group. And so that's been a different kind of a network. And it's not that kind of a network particularly I'm focusing on. What I'm really wanting us to think about today are the networks where we are and not even just our clusters. In fact, I'm not really thinking about that kind of Baptist cluster thing at all. I really am thinking about a network of churches and leaders in the places where God has planted us, and reflecting on what makes those things work, what makes them healthy, how they can be something that releases life instead of drains it from us. So those are kind of the thoughts that we'll be thinking about today. Well, that's given you enough time to reflect on your own experience. David's introduced himself briefly to us, so I'm going to come back to him later, and I'm going to go around as I do on my screen. So I'll give you the warning. It's going to be Adrian Ward first, and then David Skeet. So when I introduce David, I'll let you know who's next. So we'll kind of go around. And, that's what we'll do. Is that okay? So Adrian, I'm going to start with you. Just kind of share where you're at and a bit of that while you're here. Don't feel the need to kind of be brief, but you know, if I start doing this at you, then you've come over there. You started to preach, you know.
Yeah. Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Adrian Ward. I'm a minister at South Woodham Evangelical Church, which is a Baptist church in Essex, just between Chelmsford and Southend. I've been here for just over a year. I moved into the church here in just before Christmas 2020, so right in the midst of lockdown and all of that. So that was quite an interesting venture. But before that, I was a minister in Huddersfield, and before that, I was in Northamptonshire at Desborough Baptist Church, where I was for a number of years. So I moved around the country a little bit, and have experienced different church networks, sort of local church councils and things like that, and also in Huddersfield across we had something called Hope Huddersfield, which was a wider network that organised bigger events and things together. In the context here in the town, we have South Woodham Christian Council, which is a long-standing group representing all the churches in the town and in all the different flavours of church that there are here in the town. So that's the network that I'm sort of currently part of locally. So that's a bit about me.
Great, thank you. That's fab. I really appreciate that. I hadn't realised you were at Desborough, I don't think. So was that same time I was in Northampton? Was it? I was 2000 2006.
Well, I moved to Desborough in 2000 and then trained for ministry with them from 2004. So and was there until 2017. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you were Jeff and Pauline's pastor for a while as well.
I was, yeah. Moved away just before Jeff died. Yeah.
Wow, there we go. Sorry, personal stuff, but you know, Jeff was my first Baptist senior pastor and my mentor.
Yeah, good chap.
An amazing guy. Yeah. David Skeet, we're going to come to you, and after that, Andy Mills will be coming to you. So that gives you a warning. Go ahead, David.
Thanks, Jonathan, and good morning, everyone. I'm David Skeet. I'm pastor, team leader at Swalnest Baptist Church. It's a small church just outside of Sheffield in an ex-mining community, not too far from Orgreave, for those which I'm sure everyone here will remember, back at the 80s of the miners' strikes and the riots and the troubles. And I mention that because I think it's quite key to the context that I find myself in here. So I arrived in the August of 2019, just fresh from as a minister in training, which was in Hare Hills in Leeds. So extremely different context, different surroundings, different demographic makeup as well, as you can imagine, coming from a big, large multicultural city to a small, I'd say 99.9% white British village, with the mindsets and what goes on there. I'm struggling, if I'm honest, with the ecumenical partnership of the churches together that we have. It's just a case of the yearly events, so the Easter March of Witness and the Christmas and the remembrance service that happens in the November, then of course the December, the Christmas stuff, and that is pretty much it. Outside of that, I've struggled over these years, and of course we've had COVID, but we've really struggled to get together and discuss what really goes on. And I've been told when I first came there was lots that went on. It was a big, healthy, thriving group where it had treasurer, secretary, it had lots of capital in the bank, if you like, and they did lots of stuff. But then for some reason, and I still can't get to the bottom of it, it kind of disbanded, and it's just down to the three ministers of to do these various things throughout the year, but nothing more goes on with that. And of course, like anywhere, there's lots of social injustice that needs addressing, and lots of things we could get involved in, I'm sure, and really see God's kingdom grow and extend as we try to share our faith and witness as we journey with people. But all seems to be brick walls at the moment, so I'm kind of seeking inspiration.
Thank you, David. We appreciate that. We were joking earlier about there being an expert, and then somebody from God's country shows up. So it's that's the great to have you with us, Andy Mills, and then we're going to come to Andy Gore.
Hi there. It's good to be with you. I'm serving currently at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, but I've only just been here just over 6 months now. Before that, I was in Chard in Somerset for 7.5 years. And before that, I was 9 years in Southampton, a place called Thornhill. And quite different contexts in terms of interchurch dynamics, really. In Southampton, it was quite difficult, sort of in a city that size, to have any real interchurch network that worked effectively. But as a church, we worked with 2 or 3 local churches to our context in a very productive way in terms of sort of social action. We did a brilliant project where it was basically guerrilla gardening, where we took over one of the big parks and did lots of projects there with a couple of other churches, and that was really effective in just ways we were doing things there. But it was a very sort of organic sort of network that came out without any sort of formal structure to it at all. But then moving to Chard in Somerset, and I came across a Churches Together structure that was thriving there. It was a town that was just big enough to hold together the 7 churches in a way that enabled them to work together. They focused on doing practical projects together, so did lots of things all through the year. And it was really successful, and really strong bonds developed between the churches and between the leaders as well. And moving to Woodstock 6 months ago in the midst of COVID, there was a sort of Churches Together structure there, but it's sort of fallen by the wayside because of COVID. Ministers have changed, and I think it's always been the ministers that have kept things going. And so I'm just here really, a bit like David, just to get some inspiration and just sort of look at how we can take things forward. I think any impetus may fall upon me to get Churches Together once again working in Woodstock. Much smaller place, only 4 churches. One of the Catholic Church probably won't have much input into it, but just to see where things go.
Great, thank you. Andy, I want you to be encouraged. I think it often falls to us Baptists to do something, and that's probably because I think, and I'll share a reason why later, I think we're the best at doing this. I think there's something about being Baptist that makes us the ideal people in a place to build the networks. We're going to come to Andy Gore and then to David Lewis.
Okay, well, good morning all. I a little place called Johnfield. I'm close to David in Swallownest. I'm in northeast Derbyshire. I'm part of the Yorkshire Association, and I've been here 8.5 years, having been 15 years in Whitton near Twickenham, and then before that 7 years in Enfield in North London. I've always had fairly enjoyable and positive experience of working with local networks. In Enfield, the churches were geared, or there 4 churches around, predominantly to working class estates built in the 30s, from either the Enfield ordnance factories up there in Totteridge, or where we were. It was essentially the overflow from the East End slum clearances. In Whitton near Twickenham, a small place of 4 to 5 churches, where actually it's just very, very leisurely and chilled relationships. We didn't do a huge amount. apart from as who was the first person spoke about the four main seasons of ecumenical life, January and Christmas and Easter sort of stuff. John feels very different. When I came and had the interrogation tea, that routine of meeting the church, at the back of the room there were 3 dog collars, because they invite local pastors to be part of the interview process. So we've had a church covenant active since the mid-90s, and really is quite a strong and robust relationship between churches. We used to have a collection of ecumenical charities. One was a youth ministry, which where we had a very vibrant, we began as a bus, then the bus fell apart, so they moved into the Baptist church, which didn't fall apart, where you did like 80 to 100 kids every Friday night just hanging out and chilling. It's just a safe place in which to everyone to function. And the teams that operated that were made from all the churches across the whole board and stream. They say there are 13 churches part of this group. We have monthly worship together, which was suspended during COVID, but is now back up and running again. We do some Holy Week. We have early mornings of worship and communion every day together, which is say from Monday after Palm Sunday through to Easter, Holy Saturday. And again, that's great. And often Easter is falls on the 3rd Sunday, so that's a good opportunity like this year to worship together as churches. We also are planning as a group of churches to purchase a building for a social ministry. So that at the moment may well be derailed by our local new church, or what was a house church, who are very keen on that sort of ministry, and they may actually sort of pull the rug from under our feet and do it all by themselves, which is a bit of a shame. They've had a change of leadership within the church, and the person now who is the leader of the church is very much, he's grown up born and bred in Johnfield, but he forgets that we are very much a collaborative community. The whole town itself, where we live, actually is highly collaborative, it's highly integrated, and so as churches, it's a natural thing to do, to cooperate and to collaborate with each other.
Great. I'm going to move you on, Andy. That's because we might come to some of that stuff later. We might get a chance to talk about it. David Lewis and then Paul Graham.
Hi, I'm David. I'm a Baptist minister in an ecumenical partnership in Milton Keynes. Milton Keynes is ecumenicity in that sense. There are 5 big LEPs in Milton Keynes, and Stantonbury, where I am, is one. We're one church with 6 buildings and 6 congregations. I have a full-time Anglican colleague, a quarter of a Methodist minister, a couple of self-supporting Anglican ministers, and we're generally responsible for 1 or 2 of the congregations, 1 or 2 of the churches, although we do minister around the different partnerships, different churches in the partnership. Before that, I was in Essex at Hutton and Shenfield Union Church, which was a Baptist URC ecumenical project. And before that, I was down just outside Worthing in Findon Valley. Reflecting on the networks that I was involved in, we had a very good local network down in Worthing, and a very good local network just outside Brentwood. There were about half a dozen churches, and we met together. We did Lent studies together. We walked, witnessed together, were involved in mission together. Coming here, although it's an ecumenical partnership, there are 4 denominations. We're Baptist, Methodist, URC, and Anglican. The partnership and the networking hasn't been so good. I've been here now 6 years with a real sort of mission to try and build partnership. But that's sometimes been a bit of a struggle. One of the questions that I'm hoping that we'll get a chance to look at today concerns what's the ideal size for a network. And there at the moment, talking about how can we network Milton Keynes. Well, Milton Keynes is a huge growing city, and I'm just wondering whether, if you're talking about 100 odd churches or more, how you network that. So that's the sort of kind of question, building what size network that I'm hoping to look at.
Hold that question. We may well get a chance to come to that afterwards. Sorry, I'm sneezing a little bit and coughing here, so I keep muting myself and then not doing it. Thank you, David. Appreciate you. Paul, and then we're going to come to Ali Taylor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me along. And if I disappear, I'm blaming rural broadband connection. So if I aren't very easy to hear, then I can apologise for that. Yeah, where I am, I'm in Clare in Suffolk, in the little corner down on the Cambridgeshire-Essex border. We're in the smallest town in Suffolk. We are a town, but most people call us a village, and then they get chased out with pitchforks. And we're in a town where there are 4 churches, 4 church communities, of which I am nominally chair of the Churches Together group. That's only because the Catholics keep giving me the job. The Anglican minister only arrived a year ago, and the URC are currently a vacancy, so it's more by default. I'm also, for my sins, the ecumenical rep for Church Together in Suffolk, which is quite fun because I am the furthest point from most of the things that go together with Churches Together, either in Bury or Ipswich. Tends to be where the people focus, and certainly more in the urban context than the rural context. I sort of fly a rural flag as well as the Baptist flag within that setting. Previously, I was at Lechlade in Gloucestershire, having come out of Swindon to go into training, where we were one of only 2 churches in the town, and the relationship was really strong. Cotswold cultural Anglicanism reigned supreme, which meant our still Baptist chapel had to fight our corner all the time and sort of shout loudly to be heard. A lady came in a couple of months before I left to say, "It's so good that you're open again." As a church, we were never closed, but we just hadn't made ourselves loud enough, it seemed. But that's one of the things about, certainly in a rural context, where Clare, if you look at Clare, if you ever visited Clare, the first thing you'll see as you get into the centre is the enormous church, abbey-sized parish church we have here. It's absolutely huge, built on rule money, and of course we've got the Priory, which a lot of people from outside the community visit and spend a really good time in the thin space that is the Priory. And then there's us in the Baptist Church who have been very active ones within the wider community, and then the URC who are struggling. We keep hearing of URC closures in the local area. Talking to the secretary there yesterday, what were 7 churches when the last minister arrived is now down to 3. And so they're looking at boundaries. Yeah, huge boundaries for them, which means any sense of ministerial cover within the URC framework in our area is negligible to nil. So from my perspective, connections are really important. Sometimes you can feel very, very isolated very, very quickly. And don't even start on a Baptist cluster idea. And that just fell apart some years ago and has never been regenerated, partly through actually it just isn't worth the hassle of trying to fix diary dates to get together. It just don't happen. And there's always a good reason not to meet rather than a good reason to meet. If I sound jaded about it, I apologise.
Well, I think many of us are who tread the journey towards trying to draw churches together. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate that. Now, how many of us, until you've just moved, it's become clear, Ali, but where you were sitting a few minutes ago, I wonder how many of us are thinking, what's Ali doing in the church car park? Because in our church car park, because for a minute it was like, that's definitely outside my church in the car park. So it was
absolute apologies for this. I just suddenly got called to sit on our toddler desk. So
wonderful. Well, after Ali, then Edith.
So I wasn't in the car park. What we've done during lockdown is build a link building between our main church and our separate building. So it now looks, our outside wall is now inside, but it's so apologies for that. I just said that my lady went and I had to go and help. I'm at Baptist Church in Stevenage. I'm associate we're quite a sort of busy church. I've been here 3.5 years, just about finishing my NAMS training. I did my MIT training down in Gloucestershire in a church there. I guess it would be, down in Gloucester, I was part of a kind of fairly small network of about sort of 3 local churches, because there were quite a few spread across the city. And then kind of here we've got quite a big kind of Churches Together network, but not as many, you know, there are lots of people signed up to it, but not as many participating. And really it's just, I guess it was sort of touching on base really to hear other people's wisdom, to listen to other people's experiences, because I feel like I'm on the beginning of a journey.
Thank you, that's great. Edith?
I've got, at the moment I'm beginning to retire, and but previously my partnerships that I've been involved with in Curtin and Lindsay, I was the second minister to a congregation of 15 and paid by a charity, and the remit for me was to get involved in the community. And what I did was the town didn't really work well together, and I helped to establish an LEP, which is now quite flourishing. And also because I got involved with the town hall committee, I helped to bring the council and the churches together, you know, so it ended up being a community network, which was really incredible, because it meant that people who didn't normally talk together ended up talking together, and because of that things started to move. And I used to always say that we were at like a beacon on a hill, you know, that our light was shining, but it was bringing things together. And working with the local ministers, you know, like with the children as well, it ended up being a really good thing. You know, instead of 3 tiny churches, we became a bigger church, which then influenced other things that was going on. I got involved with the faith partnership, the multi-faith partnership in North Lincolnshire, and that right at its very early stages, and that was.
Oh, we just lost you there, Edith. I think she's about to say that was really good. That looks like definitely like she's about to say really good, yeah? Have we lost everybody? Oh, boom, it's me. I've gone. Hello?
They don't get involved, you know, I find it really difficult because they're not particularly ecumenical, you know, because they're not part of Churches Together in Scotland. So it means that I find the whole thing quite difficult.
Okay. Thank you. No, thank you. I appreciate that. My internet connection has just got a bit juddery. So you all froze for 20 seconds on me just then. So let's see what happens. If it all goes pear-shaped, it should keep going because David's here and is a co-host, so he should automatically become the host. So we'll see. In which case, I'll try and log back in. But that's a bit of an interesting one. David.
Yeah.
Did you want to share anything else about networks and Unity?
Only that I've been a minister about 30 years up and down the country, and my experience has been that some of the best, most vibrant and most fantastic and spirit-filled groupings I've been part of have been ecumenical. Also, some of the dullest, direst, most pointless waste of time, energy, effort, and everything else you can possibly imagine have also been ecumenical groupings. Sadly, the latter has tended to outnumber the former, but I live in hope.
Thank you. We all live in hope, I think, David. It's a pretty good place to be. So what I want us to start off with is just some, well, we've started, and this is really, really important, is the hearing from each other. And it's just super important that we do that, because that is our context and that's where we are. That's what we're about. But we wanted to think about building healthy local networks. That's really what we want to be about today. And so what I want us to think about is what a healthy local network might look like if the scripture says how good and how pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. It's like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down on the collar of his robe. It's as if the dew of Hermon were falling on Mount Zion, for there the Lord bestows his blessing, even life forevermore, then how do we make that come alive in our contexts? And we've just heard from David that, and others of us have had that experience where sometimes the networks that we're part of don't seem to be releasing life forevermore. And if that's what the scripture says, there can feel like there's a disconnect, can't there, between the scriptural aspiration. David's made reference to Jesus' prayer in John chapter 17. We'll probably touch on that again. We've got this picture from Psalm 133, and then we have our experience. So I want to ask a question of us, and feel free to just share where you're at. But if I were to ask the question, maybe phrase it this way: what does a healthy network look like? Let me give you a second for that. If you were to try and give some expression to that, some voice to that, what might you say that a healthy network would look like? So what would be some of the characteristics of a healthy network? Anybody want to kind of let's just share together,
I'd say that there'd be some element of seeking to understand each other's traditions and background and church practice and governance, of trying to understand that to be able to work together. Yeah.
So thank you. So it's a place of understanding, not maybe. I'm going to push you a little bit, Adrian, because because it sparks thoughts in my head, and I'm an external processor. An attempt to understand, not just assume. I guess that's kind of a long
and also to not to impose. Not to imply this is the way that things have to be done because this is the way that our church law governs it. So nobody else can do what they want. So. Yeah,
there is a name for that, which we will talk about later, and it's called, let's just name it, it's called Anglican ascendancy. And so we will...
You use the polite term, so...
So yeah, we'll name that a bit later. But a healthy network then is a place where attempts are genuinely made at understanding the context, traditions, and the people from other places. Thank you. A place of active understanding. That sounds like that's pretty healthy. What else would be a healthy local network?
I go back to Hebrews, where it says, don't give up the habit of meeting together, but encourage one another. I think almost if it's not encouraging, then there's no point to it. If it's not building up the individual churches, then what's it for? Hebrews.
Really good. Yeah. I'm making notes here because the second time I teach this, I'm going to incorporate everything that you've just shared with me, everybody. So,
we're
David,
writing his master's thesis.
Absolutely, that's where my master's is going to come from. David, you were going to say something. David Skeet.
Yeah, I think echo with what Adrian and David said there, and I think it's again, it's not about imposing ideologies and thoughts on others, but actually working together collaboratively. And harmoniously, which doesn't always happen, but if you're able to build those firm foundations within that and have the perspective together, whatever our theology and understanding is, that we're seeking God's direction and need for the communities that we may find ourselves in and operate in, then that would form some of the characteristics of a healthy group to push out and see that work go on.
Great stuff. Edith?
I think having a common vision is really important, but also having a respect for each other, across gender and race and everything else. Because I think if you've got some people who are like, I remember being in part one fellowship, and the Anglican guy, he said that the only proper priest was a Catholic priest, which put everybody like, what's that about? So I think it's having a common vision and a recognition that each of us are called by God.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, genuine respect for it. David Lewis and then Andy Mills.
going back to what was said at the beginning about seeking to understand each other, I think it's also seeking to accept each other. You know, I talk about in my ecumenical dealings, not only in my local partnership, but also I'm part of what's called the Ecumenical Oversight Group in Milton Keynes. I often talk about unconscious bias against Baptists. That it's interesting, of the 6 churches where I'm a minister in this partnership, 4 of them are very long-standing Anglican churches, some going back 800 or 900 years. And I'm expected to go and take services there, but they expect me to do it the Anglican way.
Okay.
And that's a real struggle at times.
Thank you. Andy Mills.
I think it is discerning the right thing to do in the right season. We tend to flog dead horses a lot in Churches Together projects, do the same thing year after year without saying, well, is this right now?
Really appreciate that. That's great. Doing the right things for now. I really am taking notes. I'm a fast typer. Paul.
Sorry, unmuting. Yeah, taking Andy's point of view, actually, one of the interesting things is one of our projects we do as an ecumenical group here in Clare is the Walk of Witness on Good Friday. And we talked a few years ago about why we do it and whether we should do it and so on. New Vic has come along, speaking to him yesterday, he said he's really looking forward to doing it this year, which is a bit of a shame because we were hoping it was an opportunity to ditch it. But it does come down to people's own preferences and so on. But the other thing I was going to say actually before all that was about grace and being gracious, because I know there are people who in Church Together groups won't involve the Catholics because of the Catholic way of doing things, and there are Catholic churches that won't involve themselves because of their view on things like women in ministry. Edith, your point, I think is possibly where it could head about inclusion and particularly a call for that. But here in Clare, it was interesting. Our previous URC minister was a woman, and the Catholic priest had no problem working with her, alongside her, and so on, and putting aside tradition and all those sort of things that would restrict them from working together. Actually, found space for grace is a good expression for it, I think, to be able to work together.
Great, David Fleming.
Yeah, firstly, I've had a message from Ali. Ironically, for a seminar on church related, she's been excommunicated by the internet and cast into the outer darkness and can't get back in. So she apologizes. I think Edith was spot on when she spoke about mutual respect, but there's something else that floats around as well, which is a problem I've had in ecumenical gatherings, is that as a Baptist, we can compromise on almost anything. There's almost nothing that's written in to the rules and statutes saying we must have and must do and must be this. Methodists, Anglicans, Catholics, there's much more that when you get to a gathering, they say, oh, well, this must happen because canon law or whatever, or the method says. And so I was the one who ended up being expected to give way, which sometimes grated a little.
So and we're going to move on in just a moment into what is an unhealthy network, and we may well have a bit more flowing around there. But if I just summarize some of those thoughts, we talked about a healthy network then together being a place where there was the attempt to genuinely understand each other in a much bigger way, a place where there's a real encouragement, a place that's not about imposing but about real collaborative and harmonious working, a place where we work towards a shared perspective as well as a common vision, where there's genuine respect as well as genuine acceptance alongside that understanding. A discerning of the seasons, a healthy network would be a place where we can say, are we doing the right things for now? And a healthy network might be the place where it isn't always the Baptists that are expected to compromise. So I think hopefully I've captured some of the kind of picture of that. If we were to move on to the kind of the flip side question of that, then what would an unhealthy network look like? I wonder what we might immediately start to think of, so and put words on. So I don't know if anybody wants to go ahead, Andy Gore.
Okay, I think the fundamental element is indifference and an apathy. I think it's where indifference, in the sense that you're locked into and wrapped up in your own individual church and church life, as if that is all that church life can be like, rather than, I know this is back in the other side, the sense in which we are enriched and encouraged by just different ways of doing things.
Thank you. And I think that's a really important thing, not just in terms of our local churches, not what makes a healthy church engage in networks is we have a bigger vision, but I think we need to realize there are many local churches that get involved in networks and they're in there in the network, but their vision goes no further than their own local church. And so everything that's happening in the context of that conversation, so you may have a conversation where you're talking together about something that's going to bless your city, your town, your village, and the 6 people in the meeting, 5 of whom are talking about blessing the place, and 1 of whom has in mind just blessing their church. And so that disconnect, so an unhealthy network can be one where people are in there not for the sake of the network, the place, or for some other bigger reason, but they're in that network solely for the purpose of blessing their own local fellowship. And that's when often that opt-out comes of, if I can't lead it, or if it doesn't bless my church immediately, I'm not in it. And so thank you, Andy. I appreciate that. So that, an unhealthy network is one where any church, any individual church, and if there are more than one, of course, it becomes even more difficult. But an unhealthy network is one where a church is only there to fulfill its own vision, only there to see its own congregation blessed, its own organization blessed. Go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say the fear of a crumbling empire, where churches see their empire failing and falling and worrying that they're not going to be there for the next generation rather than looking at building kingdom.
Okay, thank you.
Sometimes I've seen both extremes, ones that are so structural that there's no life. Everything has to be done via points of order, and they're just, or so relational that one personnel change blows it all out of the water, and you've got to start from scratch again because there's nothing holding it together other than the relationships. That sounds bad, but you know what I mean. And once a person leaves or one key member of clergy moves, everything grinds to a halt.
Thank you. Great, appreciate that. Who else? An unhealthy network. So I would want to go on, Heidi.
I think sometimes somebody was saying about Baptist churches being insular as well at times, and I think whenever you've got a congregation that does lip service to ecumenism, but often what they're saying is we'll see the minister out because this is really their baby and not something that we are embracing ourselves, and I think that can be quite unhealthy.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to share what might make an unhealthy network? Go on, Andy.
I think one church being an ascendancy. I mean, you talked about Anglican ascendancy, but in some communities that could be a big community church or any big church that feels it's got the power or the person power, the numbers to dominate the agenda.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Well, I'm going to push us a little bit, and with all these thoughts, all these experiences, these ideas of what a healthy network and an unhealthy network might look like, and I don't want to force one particular thought in this. So I might reflect on Wolverhampton, which was a particular kind of network, and it was lots of different movements and denominations. and the traditional model of ecumenism was not a driving philosophy in what was happening. So, I'd have that in mind, but some of you will have in mind, so for example, Paul's structure, quite a kind of structured place. Here is this network of churches that are working together. I chair that, it has a structure, and there are some philosophies that underlie that, which are perhaps the traditional ecumenical and ecumenism philosophy. So I don't want us to force into one model. So let's just flesh out another question together that perhaps takes us a little further in this. If we've been thinking about what does a healthy church network, a healthy network look like, and an unhealthy network, I want to ask the question, why are we meeting? So I think it's a key question, why? And a really good question for us to be asking right now. So I think this question, we'll do a whole other seminar perhaps another day on applying this to our local churches, but in terms of our networks and in terms of the wider groupings that we belong to, let's just sit with this question for a few minutes. Why are we meeting? What is the point of us meeting? What are we doing it for? We might draw out of that some good reasons for us, as well as some less good reasons. So why are we doing this? What are we in it for? Perhaps somebody wants to kind of just pick up on that and the good reasons for doing it, because I think there are some really, really bad reasons for doing it. Some of the bad reasons are we've always done it. Some of the bad reasons are, if we don't do it, what will we lose? There's like a fear thing. Some of the bad reasons are to increase my profile as a minister. But if in a moment of honesty, maybe we realize that is why I'm here. Actually, I'm in this group because it's the one place where I can exert some influence or whatever. But anyway, if we sit with that for a few moments, why are we meeting? What are we doing it for? What would be the driving force for us to want to meet with other churches and to connect with them and to be in a network with others? What would be the advantages? What are the good reasons? Why are we meeting? Oh, and deathly silence. That's kind of worrying, isn't it? That's quite worrying. Go on, Andy Mills.
I think the churches I've been in, there's no way that would have been able to impact our local community for Christ on our own. We needed to join with other churches, other Christian organisations to do that, and that's why it's always been networking with other churches that's been important for me, certainly.
Thank you. So the networking has increased the impact. So we do more together than one church does alone. We can do more together. That's great. Thank you. So there's a multiplication of our impact, amplification of our voice. Thank you. Edith?
I remember in Catton and Lindsay, as the churches came together and became more united, it made a difference to the whole community. And it was almost leading by example, so that, before we weren't talking to each other, but now we were. And that helped to build something special within the community to enable other people to see, well, if they can do it, we can do it as well. So I think it's leading by example.
Thank you, Edith. That's a great thought, isn't it? My sidebar thought to that comes immediately to mind, and I've just made a note in my own notes, is I wonder if the impact of that kind of leadership is amplified even more in smaller communities. So, that's an interesting thought. David?
Yeah, I think one of the things is there's a danger in existing too much in an echo chamber. And mixing, say, in Lent study groups, for example, with people whose outlook is radically different, can force you to think about what you believe and evaluate your own Baptist understandings. Now, you might think there's a wide enough spectrum within your Baptist church, but I think there is something valuable in talking about baptism with people who baptize babies, for example. and have to defend what you practice and ask questions about what they do. I
Very
think it
good.
can be enriching.
Very good. Thank you. Well, I did wonder whether we were going to get a traditional ecumenical formula, which might look something like, let's not do apart what we can do together. And you perhaps heard a phrase like that if you're involved in ecumenical. Paul, go on. You want to respond to that?
Yeah, I was tempted to do that, and then thought no, because I'll probably get kicked out of the group for trite statements. But it's also, I mean, the thing is, why you do these things is sometimes to encourage people that they can do things together rather than not do them apart. Because that's a good reason to me to actually resource sharing and understanding that actually sometimes a church has a really good idea but doesn't have the personnel to do it, or the people on the ground to do it. But actually, if you introduce it as a churches together event or an ecumenical initiative, it actually could get off the ground. But also I was going to add to my own reasoning for doing it, and I kind of take the best of Adrian, which is about understanding each other's traditions and things, and then go, actually it's entirely selfish. I know it's probably not the best of reasons to do it, but I'm loving sitting with the church together in Suffolk group, because I sit with a Quaker and a Lutheran pastor and a Methodist minister, none of whom I would meet with if I just stayed where I am. So it's kind of the best and worst of both worlds.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. So I wonder sometimes, and I'm just going to share some thoughts now, which you might like and you might not like. But we have this question while we're meeting, and I threw up that kind of what is sometimes thought of as a traditional kind of underpinning of ecumenical thought, and a number of you, once I said that, sort of nodded and smiled, and you've seen this phrase before. Let's not do apart what we could do together, and that has become for so many a kind of driving force for so much of the shared activity of churches with others. So in traditional Baptist nonconformist style, I want to ask the question, have we really got into an idolatry of this together? And that the together has become the aim without any wider context to what on earth we're together for. And so is there a risk that one of the reasons perhaps why some of our local networks have become unhealthy or are not releasing life, they're not places where God's blessing is flowing, even life forevermore? And for me, I guess I would go towards places that release life as a sign of health. Healthy things grow and healthy things live. And so is it releasing life? Is one of the reasons our local networks no longer release life because all we've got is this, we've got to be together, without any wider sense of the why. Why are we meeting? Well, we're meeting because we believe we shouldn't do apart what we could do together. And I want to ask the question, have we now got into, in some places, an idolatry of together? Is that provocative enough for a conversation for a few minutes? Is there a risk of an idolatry of the idea of just together without anything more than that? Have we seen that? Have we witnessed that? I don't know if anybody wants to share a reflection on that. Have I just shot somebody's sacred cow? In which case, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Well, we're going to have a break for coffee.
Jonathan,
yeah.
To want it to be equally provocative, what you just said seems, I almost said utterly pointless, in the sense that it's not my experience, not how they are questions that we don't ask here in Johnfield because they are irrelevant questions, in the sense that I get the drift of what you're saying about we value being together, and we actually, in the sense of having a purpose, yeah, absolutely. But the sense in which, again, not wanting to be so that level of navel gazing is almost like an irrelevancy, in the sense that enjoy, so we meet fortnightly as fraternal, as ministers, leaders, and where anything it's a meeting that's open for anything, for everything, for other people to share their deepest issues or needs, or just have a good laugh and a cup of coffee or a meal together. So I don't think we are exploring of getting beyond, if you like, the chair, vice chair, treasurer, secretary sort of format of how we meet together as a group of churches, to do something a bit more, quote, relational. But that is not because we are idolize being together, but I think there is a sense in which having joined, become part of a long established relationship where it's underpinned by a covenant none of us signed, in the sense of as leaders of the churches here, but actually that it is just part and parcel of the fabric of the framework, the nature of our relationship. They are not necessarily unquestioned foundations, but they're foundations that you don't need to dig up to make sure they're still there, because that's deeply destabilized. But actually, there's a sense in which we just almost have that, not natural, but there is that's about one thing about a healthy, it's a sense of a trust that as personnel change, we still maintain that sense of this is a trusting place in which together is not the end but it is always a means towards whatever the means, the end we're looking at.
Thank you. And I think that's wonderful that it feels like an irrelevance to you. I genuinely do. No, it's great. Honestly, celebrate it. Thank God for it regularly, because my sense is the experience of many people in many places. And it's not been my experience in recent years, but I reflect on the very first time I encountered any kind of real ecumenism stuff, any kind of local network building. And the first time I went along to that was a Churches Together in Beverley, which is in East Yorkshire, and I was a Pentecostal minister. And so, here's the meeting, the date's in this diary, we gather. And so I got there and I sat through this whole meeting, and at the end I said, but what are we doing this for? And the answer was, well, because it's good for us to be together. And that was the only answer. And my experience has been, as I've worked in networks and have built networks, that sometimes people have been in the network. So Connect Wolverhampton, there is no Churches Together Wolverhampton that's functioning, and it would be very difficult to get it going in that city because Connect Wolverhampton is such a large network. But there were people who wanted to connect from other villages and nearby to what we were doing, because their local network was all about just, the bottom line was, together. That's it. There is nothing else. And so, and that machine in Beverley had a secretary, had a treasurer, had a chair, had meetings every other month, was like draining resources out of the local church. And it was all on the altar of together, but for no other reason than just to be together. So I think for some people, their experience is a little different. And I want to suggest that can be a draining thing. David Lewis wanted to jump in.
One of the questions for me, which is around this question you're asking, is which networks to belong to. I mean, there are at least half a dozen networks that perhaps I ought to be part of here. And if I gave adequate time to each of the networks, I'd never be doing anything else. I mean, I think that's the difficult question as to which networks are fruitful for me, from a church, from a partnership. But there are so many networks that I could belong to here in Milton Keynes, and I struggle to know which ones are, in a sense, the right ones.
Very good, very good. And I think that's a really good question. We'll hold it. We might come back to it. My immediate response, and I'm going to move us on in our conversation. My immediate response is, David, that my brother died a couple of years ago, and he was 48 years old, and he died 2 years ago, nearly 3 years ago now. And that gave me a massive wake-up call, like a huge wake-up call about how short life is. And I genuinely have got to that stage where I'm saying to a lot of people, you should stop doing that, because life is really, really short and you've only got one of them. And so I think it's a really great question to be asking. In a finite life for you as a minister and in a finite ministry, actually, what is it that you really want to spend time on? And I think it's a really good question, an okay question to ask. But I also want to flip that into the life of a church. A church has only got so much time and a church has only got so much energy. There's an awful lot of should-bes. And then there's a bunch of stuff that releases life and hope and actually does what you want to be doing and getting on with it. I think it's absolutely fine to stop doing some stuff in order to focus on the things that really are the things that release life, in the context of what is it that God has spoken to each of us. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Life is really short and we only have this one. And so it's a really good question to be asking. What I want to do is turn a little bit on its head this formulation that we have heard, not to kind of just criticize for the sake of criticism's sake, because I recognize in me there is a tendency to do that from time to time. But instead of that question of let's not do a part what we could do together, I want to suggest that perhaps we might helpfully ask ourselves this question: let's do together what we cannot do apart. And so, what are the things that actually God has for us to do that would be impossible for us to do just on our own? And maybe that's a good starting point. And just before we go to coffee and take a little break, because I'm aware that it's 7 minutes past 11, and I'd said to David, we might not be very long on this, but it's going to be very conversational. I want to suggest that there are 3 things that are better done together than they are apart. David?
No, sorry, I was just saying goodbye to Edith. She's leaving to go to the funeral.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Bless you, Edith. Yeah, I didn't see the goodbye. Bless you, Edith. Hope it goes well. And so I'm going to plant the thought and then say we go to coffee, which gives you some time to think about this. I want to suggest that there are things that we can do much better alongside others that take us beyond the just together, but start to ask together for what. And I want to suggest that there might be to minister to God, to minister to each other, and to minister to our city, and cities in inverted commas, because some of us live in villages and some of us live in towns, but the scripture speaks a lot about city. And so I want to suggest that healthy networks, the networks that we might want to devote our time to, the place where we as Baptists might be making a really significant impact, and how we can work towards building a local network that is healthy. One of those things will be to have an answer to this question: what is it what we're going to do together? And I want to suggest here's what some of the answer might look like. We're together to minister, first of all, to God. And the Psalm 133 passage, it's good when God's people dwell together in unity and God commands his blessing there. God is pleased with that. And that's a good reason. And so there is something of our ministry to God, a ministry of worship and of prayer, a ministry of service, a ministry of dedication, which happens in the context of unity. And so drawing ministers especially, but not just ministers, but churches together, first of all, to minister to God, to please him, to worship together, to fast together, to pray together, pleases God. And it's worth doing because it pleases God. Secondly, there's the each other. And we're ministers here, and I want to think about ministers, and I'm unashamedly, along with David and 2 others, the administrator of a group that ministers to ministers. That's kind of where my gig is. That's where I'm at. That's how I'm wired. Our local networks should be places where ministers are able to care for other ministers and receive the kind of support and encouragement and love that sustains our ministry. Too often our ministers' groupings and these local networks are characterized by competition, jealousy, fear, suspicion. I had, in Wolverhampton, I had a really difficult time one year, and I'll share this without giving too much detail, but we had a very key member of my leadership team who I was incredibly close to write me a letter on a Sunday evening, so that when I got home after the service on a Sunday evening, there's a letter on my mat, and it was their resignation from leadership and from the life of the church over an issue that had become very bitter and divisive. And I was in tears. I was just in absolute tears as I read this letter. My wife Susanna said, "What's happened?" And I showed her the letter. And as I showed her this letter, my phone just beeped, and it was a really close friend of mine, a guy called Steve Uppel. And Steve just sent a message saying, "Hey, I'm at an airport in America. I'm about to set off for the UK, but I just had this nudge that I needed to get in touch. What's happening?" And so I said, texted him back and said, Steve, and he knew this leader, this leader's resigned and I'm in bits because it's just terrible. He texted back and he said, Jonathan, 3 things you need to know. Firstly, I love you and you're my brother. Secondly, I'm praying for you. Thirdly, we'll get through this together. I'll see you when I get back. And you see, I think there's something about our ministers' networks that should be places where those kinds of relationships, where ministers have each other's backs, support each other, love each other, care for each other, that is rare, but I think is the sign of an absolutely healthy local network. And then thirdly, our city. Scripture speaks often about city. And in Jeremiah 29, we get that, I know the plans I have for you. But earlier than that, what comes before that, the releasing of God's plans and what we do in the in-between time while we're here living in exile, God says, work for the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I've called you. Often the language of city is used in prophetic writings and in visions. And this idea of city, the place where we're called, is a place where we recognize we're not the only ones that belong to it or it belongs to. So sometimes the language of gatekeepers or sentinels or watchmen and women over a city is used as we think about strategic places and locations and people and ministries. I want to suggest that each community of God's kingdom in a place ought to be working with others. The together is for the sake of our city. You'll notice I haven't written minister to our local churches in this, because my sense is that that is a trickle down rather than a primary reason. If we gather together well and we meet together well to minister to God, if we meet together well and we foster the kind of relationships amongst ministers that release health over one another, and if we minister together and network together and our city is blessed, then the natural outcome of that is that our local congregations will be blessed. The natural outcome of that is that our ministries will be blessed and there'll be a kind of a natural flow through. Now, is that pie in the sky and idealistic nonsense? Won't we do all this stuff and the big church will sweep up all the fruit? And it raises all kinds of questions. But fundamentally for me, I want to turn on its head that let's not do apart what we could do together for the sake of the together, and instead say, no, let's do together what's impossible for us to do apart. Let's focus on that. It's impossible for us to effectively minister to God in a unified way. It's impossible for us to watch over each other as ministers and share that load and that burden. It's impossible for us to be everything that God's calling us to be for our city if we do that alone. So we better do it together. And with those thoughts, we're going to break for coffee. Let's come back in 10 minutes. Is that okay? For just a final kind of wrapping up, some thoughts around that and a bit of what we might be able to do what keys might we have to unlock local healthy networks and some of the questions. So that's what we're going to come back and do. It's 11:13 on my computer. I'm amazed that we're still managing to keep going. My computer is been playing up, not my computer, rather the network, but here we are. That's good. I'm going to pause the recording. So thank you. I want us to spend just a few moments. I want to think about some keys that might unlock healthy networks, and then give some time for reflections on all that we've shared, as well as a time to ask questions. And I would encourage us to submit questions that we answer together, and we just kind of deal with that together. So for a few moments, I'll read that in just a second. Whilst I sent you off with that thought in head that rather than just the aim and the idolatry of together being everything, that there was something about ministering to God, ministering to each other, and ministering to our city. And of course, what that looks like in your context is going to look very, absolutely dependent on context. I'm not going to say it has to look like this, but what I want to do is just share what I think might be keys to unlocking healthy networks, things that I've found have really been a blessing in the places where I've been, and then we'll have just a chance to deal with some questions. So trying to do 3 things at once here, which is never a smart thing to do, so I'll just ignore that for a second. We left with this slide that the together to do might be better than just together as the aim in itself, which I'm aware isn't everybody's point of view. For some people, just the together is fine, and somehow that being together is enough. And if that is enough for you, well, then the Lord bless you. I think when we look at passages like John 17, we see that Jesus' prayer for unity has an aim that the whole world might know. And there's, one of God's plans for seeing the whole world come to faith is the unity of the church. And so I think the unity for unity's sake, just the together, I think, even in its own terms, Scripture pushes beyond that and gives us a reason for that. So let's just have a think for a moment. And I'm sorry that the text of this is probably pretty small, but what bricks for building with? And I said earlier on, I thought that as Baptists, we were uniquely situated to build better local networks. And David's already hinted at this earlier on when he talked about our willingness to compromise, but we are those who bring with us, yes, that willingness to compromise, but it isn't just because we're into compromise for compromise's sake. It's because there are certain things that we value. We value, as Baptists, all voices. We seek to discern together. We, as amongst Baptist, amongst Christian communities, perhaps uniquely, practice this radical discerning listening together when we do it well. When we're great Baptists, then we're really good at hearing what God is saying through each other. And I think often what is needed in our gatherings is a stronger Baptist presence, because the value that we bring, if we can speak of that value and if we can model that value of hearing all voices, of recognizing that the word of God for all of us might come from various voices being stitched together eventually as somebody spots the thread and hears God speaking through it all, is something we are brilliant at. The fact that we are not bound by the kind of ecclesiological and ecclesiastical rules that some of our sisters and brothers in ministry are bound by means that we can be far more creative and open and see the new thing in a way that others can't. So I think our local networks are desperate for more of us, desperate for some of the things and the values that we bring, desperate for the kind of openness, the radical listening, the hearing of voices, and the discerning for what God has for us. So I think we're uniquely placed to do that. What other bricks might be really helpful for us? I think if we work hard to ensure that there is an open table, and so that all of those who profess Christ have a way into the body of Christ gathering together. Sometimes there can be real gatekeepers to some of those movements and unity networks and whatever that have very, very restrictive. So here in Woodford, there is an evangelical fellowship. They think I'm pretty heretical because I'm a charismatic, and so their table and the powerful voices at that table are FIEC, strongly evangelical, strongly conservative churches. I would be allowed to go, but it would be very clear that my seat at the table would probably be behind somebody else's. And there are other networks that, for various other theological reasons or practical reasons or issues of size or whatever, mean that the table and the seats at the table are fairly tightly monitored and controlled. And I want to suggest that healthier networks have an open table. If I reflect on Wolverhampton, about a year before New Frontiers wanted to plant a church in Wolverhampton, they sent their pioneer, who came to a leaders' gathering and walked through the door with trepidation in his heart, he would say. His name was Anthony. And say, well, look, I'm here because I want to kind of get to know you guys and to talk about what's happening. And we're thinking of planting a church. And the response was, welcome to the party. Wolverhampton's a big place. There's lots for us to do here. Come and join us and figure out what you can be doing too. That space for people to come, I think, is super important, and to come into that space knowing that there's room at the table for them. One of the things that I've heard from some of you talking about healthy and unhealthy relationships, and something that I think builds better networks, is when they prioritize relationships. So we've already heard about some churches that have been involved in doing some practical things for their city or their town. I want to suggest to you that churches are better positioned to respond to the needs of the town when good relationships are already in place. So if there's already the love and the trust, if there's already that sense of a shared vision that we're here to minister to God, we're here to bless the city, if that's already in place and then backed up by strong relationships, then we're far more enabled to move swiftly to meet local needs as they rise, to respond to the things that are happening in our locality. Alongside that prioritizing of relationships, we have to put to death pride and a jostling for position in our own hearts. I think it's something that we can model. It's a sacrifice that we can make that will lead to others. I've been trying to chase down the source of the quote. The best quote I can come up with, the best source is Mark Twain, but I can't actually find a quote for it. So if you know it, please let me know. But the quote is, "There is no limit to what we can achieve so long as we don't mind who takes the credit." And I think something about us being open-handed in relationships says, I'm prepared to invest in something and to make something happen, even if you get the credit for it in the end, because what happened was far more important. And my relationship with you is far more important. And our relationships together are built on a common sense of trust, not this jostling for position and this pride. So one of the bricks for building healthy networks, I think, is that there are places where we prioritize good relationships together. Which of the networks that you're in are the ones where somebody would respond to you in a moment of crisis and in a moment of need? Have you got a genuine friend in those networks? And by genuine friend, I mean somebody you would turn to in a moment of need, somebody who you would trust to take you out for a coffee, a drink, or something, to advise you in a time when you're in difficulty. It's easy to have friends when all's going well and we're just laughing and joking and going out and having fun. But who would be the people you'd turn to in a moment of difficulty? One of the bricks for building better networks and healthy networks is to have a real clarity of purpose. What is it that we're here for? What is it we're trying to do? I think what David shared earlier about the difficulties that come when there is a lack of that clarity, when it's relationship alone, means that, as he said, when somebody moves on, then a whole network can just fall apart. When there is no kind of clarity on, well, this is what we're about, this is our story, this is where we're heading, not in a way that becomes a constraint, but is like a scaffolding upon which everything else can be built, can again be something that releases life and makes things healthy. Because where there is a lack of clarity around those things, there is an uncertainty and a hesitancy and a trepidation, because and a bit of a holding back sometimes. Healthy networks are ones in which we challenge and we avoid, and I'm naming it, Anglican ascendancy. So I don't know how many networks you've been in or I've been in where an Anglican in the room will make the assumption, it's kind of cultural, it's like an unconscious bias almost, that because they're the Anglican, of course it's them that is in charge, of course it's them that's have the final say, of course it's them that has the truth that we all must fall into. And if nothing else happens today, hear from me with whatever authority I have in this world, you are free to puncture that. You're free to call it out. And I think for us as Baptists, as nonconformists, there's an absolute role for us in calling some of this out and naming it. And I've named it in networks, and I've said to networks that I've been in gentle ways, not in kind of hyper confrontational ways, well, I hear that, and I hear that as an Anglican, that's what you think. But of course, we're here as whatever the network is. We're here for the whole city, and there's a number of us here, and we look at it differently. We might see that point of view this way, or there's another way of doing it. And I think, and I've often named it, I think we've just kind of slipped into a bit of Anglican ascendancy, that somehow because it's the Church of England, it's got to be the way. And of course, we don't really believe that, do we? And of course, nobody will ever own up to believing that, and so they don't. Occasionally they do just kind of do it anyway, and that's on them. It's not on you. You can't be responsible for other people's bad behavior. But I think it's fine for us to name it, and it's fine for us to work to avoid it. How can you avoid it? Well, you can do things like, and this is probably healthy to avoid the ascendancy of not just Anglicans, but any big group. When I went to Wolverhampton, this network was already in existence. It was a bit smaller, and it was a good, healthy network, but it had one or two problems and one or two issues. And one of those was that everybody looked to one particular church and one particular leader. He was a great leader, a real father in the city, but it did mean that there was a kind of leaning on him for everything. And it was hard for him as well, because I'm not sure that he ever really wanted it all to be lent on him. And it meant that when it came time for him to start to think about putting things down, the thinking was, let's have another one person that holds all of this together. Again, we would have then had this kind of default ascendancy thing happening. So instead, as a good Baptist, we suggested that instead of doing that, we would just rotate everything. So yes, we'd have one person who was the figurehead, but for 2 years, and then it would need to be somebody else for 2 years, and that it was essential that it kept moving, primarily to avoid any kind of ascendancy. And it wasn't Anglican ascendancy there; it was a different thing. But we'd need to, just be mindful of this. It's not just Anglicans, but it's often Anglicans, and our story is, and the stories that we hear often are of Anglican churches that want to dominate and take over the room and suggest that their voice is the primary voice. So we can do things practically to avoid that, rotating roles in a chaplaincy team that I was part of in Northampton for the university. Everything was rotated. Every single role was rotated evenly all the time to avoid any of this kind of stuff. So you can do things structurally, but you can also do things relationally. And as Baptists, I think we have a special role in just puncturing some of this from time to time. I think some of these other good bricks, and then we're going to pause and have some time of open conversation for the rest of our time. I think we need to make sure that we don't make some of the, we ensure that the value of people who are in that network isn't dependent on their investment. So too often we've given the floor and we've given all of the influence to the churches that are paying in the most, to the churches that have the biggest purse, the ones that will payroll everything. And I want to put a question mark about whether that's really healthy, whether that is at all honoring of the Jesus who sits in the temple and watches as people bring their offering and says that the widow who put in 2 small pennies has given most because she's given out of all that she has rather than out of her excess. So I think healthy networks, one of the bricks that we can do that is to honor everybody who comes equally, not dependent on the value of their investment into what is happening. And I think that draws more investment out of people, and it creates the kind of level playing field, which is healthy for everybody. And 2 final things. I think the warm welcome, making sure that as a network, we leave that door open and we're proactive in seeking people who could be part of what we're about, welcoming them in warmly, letting them know there's a part, and then working hard to make sure people are part of what we're doing. And then a warm goodbye. We all know the reality is that ministers move on, but too often that can be an ending of something, and then that kind of person is gone. It's not marked by the wider network. It's just, it's almost not quite ignored, but it's just one of those things, and it happens. Whereas a healthy network, I think, deals really well with saying goodbye to people as they move from the city. So they're sent from our city, however we define city, village, town, whatever, they're sent from our city to their next city. So it's not just that somebody's left, but that they've been sent and they've gone with the blessing and the prayers and the encouragement of one place, taking it to another. Now, you may well have other really good bricks for building healthy networks that you want to add to our list, and that's great. In which case, the next time I do this, it'll be an even better list. But for now, I'm going to pause, having spoken for a few minutes, for your responses to that list, and also to give you space to add to it, and then for us just to have some time, questions, reflections on the things that we've shared so far. Yeah, I've come across the Emerson quote as well. Thank you, David. I've seen it quoted for Twain quite a lot, and I can't find the kind of writing credit. So if somebody has it, let me have it. That'd be great. But responses, questions, other things to add to our list of things that make for the building blocks that are really good to be in place for healthy networks, that would be good.
I think the whole language of a warm welcome is really important. So I know. So when we lived in Whitton, I went and saw when the parish priest, the Catholic priest, was they appear like in the Mr. Ben cartoons, or like the shopkeeper. They just appear out of nowhere and they're there. But I was the first person who went to see him, and at his local chapter, he said, "Why is it that the only person who's come to visit me is the Baptist minister and none of you?" And so he became he was deeply committed and invested in that small group of churches, because we went and took the first steps and his church therefore became far more involved. And so we actually followed like the dioceses of Westminster, did a lot of small group work, and we made them our Lent calls. We followed the Catholics and therefore joined with them, and that's because I was just nosy and found him and had a cup of coffee. And when Pope Benedict, when Pope Benedict said the only real church for the Catholic Church, we had a meeting the same day, and he apologized for the Pope for getting it all wrong. But hey, so yeah, but I think that how language of a warm welcome, I think, is really important. I always make sure making to see people when they move into church, your town, to make sure that, you know, we want to say you're valued, please participate, please be part of this group as much as you can.
Very good, yeah. And when I moved into Wolverhampton, a representative from that group took me out for coffee in the first month, was sent by that group to say, this group meets, we'd love for you to join us, we want you to know we're really glad you're in the city. You'll have had some extra costs as you moved that you wouldn't have been aware of. Here's a check. And it was not a check for £10, it was a check, and it was a welcome to the city check. And, you know, I'd love to say that, you know, that happens all the time, and it didn't happen all the time. It didn't happen for everybody. There were times when there was less money around and stuff. But as an example of that warm welcome, then, you know, how great. David, bless you. It's been great to have you with us. See you again sometime. Take care. David Skeet's just got to head off.
I think the welcome needs to be not just warm, but also wide. I've been in towns before where if you're one of the big five, you know, if you're a Baptist, Methodist, URC, Anglican, Catholic, and one or two others, in other words, churches that are engaged with churches together in Britain, then the welcome is warm. But if you're one of a Nigerian church, a black majority church, a new church, or an independent, the welcome has not been as warm. Let's just put it that way.
Thank you, David. And I wonder, and here's just a reflection, whether that is more true of the more traditional networks, the churches together style, and the networks that I've been in that haven't done that. So, for example, in Northampton, Adrian may have been aware of some of this stuff, but when Steve Chalk started FaithWorks in Northampton, one of our responses to that was we drew close to that. We'd done some stuff with face values that then flowed into the FaithWorks stuff, and so we, together as a group of churches, recognized that there was an opportunity for us to start doing some more things in Northampton together practically. Talk to churches together. They really didn't want anything to do with it because, to be blunt, it was very much well, we're here to be the organization for churches together, but what do you do? Well, we get churches together, but what do you do? We get churches together. Well, we'd quite like to use churches together to do some of this stuff together to meet the needs. That's not what we're here for. We're just here to get the churches together. It's very difficult. So we founded FaithWorks and just wrote to a lot of churches and said, if you'd like to be part of this, and of course, the charismatic churches, some of the evangelical churches, and churches that had struggled to be part of, I'm happy to talk about this stuff, to be part of churches together in Northampton because they didn't get the together thing and there wasn't a sense of welcome, found that there was a sense of welcome and purpose and meaning in the FaithWorks stuff. And so that became a network of 25 to 30 churches, but it included the Anglican churches and the Brethren assemblies and the Catholics and the evangelical churches as well as the Baptists, because it had a very clear sense of we're here to do this, which was to work together to bless people in the city. And that warm welcome outside of the confines of, you know, we're churches together. Are you in churches together? You know, well, no, our network isn't. We're an independent Pentecostal. Oh, well, I'm not really sure you can be part of us. And that kind of that set off, as opposed to that warm welcome of, we're here, we think we could do this, will you be part of it? And of course, FaithWorks Northampton was bigger than Churches Together in Northampton and sizes and everything. But you know, there's that. I think you're absolutely right. How wide is that welcome, and how much can be done? Yeah.
One local Churches Together group I was part of had as its part of its constitution the membership of the local group was open to those churches in fellowship or in members of Churches Together in Great Britain, which meant I had the farcical thing where I was trying to involve the pastor of a new Nigerian church, and they said, well, we'd love to have him join us. It would be great. We'd love it, but he can't. because his denomination is not part of Churches Together in Great Britain or UK or whatever it is. So yeah, we'd love to welcome, but we're not allowed to.
So I think and not getting into competition, because that's really unhelpful for the kingdom. Sometimes we can be part of establishing networks that are those wide open networks. And, you know, and I'm not saying that Churches Together in England's had its day, but I think it's not the only show in town. And there's no reason why networks that are far more wide and open shouldn't start happening and start gathering and start doing stuff together, even if it means bypassing some of that. And David Lewis is saying, but Jonathan, I'm on so many Churches Together groups that, which one do I avoid? You know, I'm not saying jump a lot, but I'm just saying, where do we focus? Andy Mills.
I mean, where I am in Woodstock, we're very close to Oxford, and there are a lot of Christians in Woodstock who travel into Oxford to the bigger churches here. And I'm just, because we're trying to get Churches Together up and running again, I'm just thinking around the idea of maybe Christians together in Woodstock. So we're not just talking about churches here, but something that maybe brings the Christians in the town together in
Very
that
good.
sort of network. And I don't know if any of us have ever been involved in anything like that.
Go on, Adrian.
Yeah, the in Huddersfield there are a number of different networks, but so the most effective one was the Hope Huddersfield, which initially sprung out of the Hope Together resources that are put together, and it became a network of pastors, ministers praying together on a monthly basis. But then 2 or 3 times during the year there would be a special event. So we had a kind of a joint service in one of the big parks in the town for 1 year, and another year produced some literature and things like that went round to as many houses as we could. So it was kind of coming together for a specific reason, a tangible reason, but there was also that ongoing prayerful support and sharing together. But it was important to have the tangible things that we did together, and that kind of brought everyone together in that strong way. And it was and continues to be a good outreach and witness to the town there.
Thank you. That's great. Really great. Questions that you thought, oh, we haven't touched on that and I really wanted to. David talked about the size of networks earlier. And I think my quick response to that is, and I want others to jump in, I think there's only so many people you can belong to in a sense and have a meaningful relationship with. And I genuinely want to push us. So I was part of a Baptist ministers cluster in in Wolverhampton, the Baptist ministers cluster I was in, where one of the people in that group said, you are my best friends. And I say this not to butter you up, but because that's a damning indictment on myself, because we never see each other month by month and I never phone you, but still you're the only people that I would speak to and the only people I turn to in a time of trouble. But we never went to the cinema, we never did anything together. It was just that kind of coffee. I think there's only a limited number of people we can belong to, but we have the chance to genuinely belong. So I think, what networks can we belong to? If it's a network for you, David, and if it's a network for you belonging in a place where you're relating and you're connecting and you're being encouraged and nurtured and cared for and watched over and have a shared journey, my guess is there's only a limited number of people in our lives that can do that kind of thing. It's hard to belong to 100 people, but it might be easier to belong to 20 or have a very close group of 7 or 10. But in terms of where our churches are connecting, I think geographically, if there are some ways in which, together with other churches in a geographical location, we can work towards trying to discern what is the Lord saying to us for this place at this time, then not just we're together because we're in Milton Keynes and we all want to be together, so let's do a together thing for the sake of together. I think I'm hopefully puncturing the together for together's sake thing, but that together for the sake of Milton Keynes is something we could do that would have an impact that goes beyond what any one of us could have, and discerns what God is saying to us together genuinely as a whole town. Then that's a different kind of belonging, but definitely a belonging that's worth being part of. So that'd be my response. Paul, was it Paul's hand up or Andy Mills' hand up? I forgot to see. Paul, go on.
That was me, sorry. I was going to say, I'm just building on that, Jonathan. I think you're absolutely right. The purpose of groups and connections is absolutely key. being a small town with 4 churches, you can kind of conflate the two if we're not careful, and you can become a mutual support group network for churches and forget the function of actually doing things together and seeing the kingdom built together. Going back to the thing you said earlier, which I think is so good, about things we do together because we can't do them apart, or the priority given towards that. But if we spend all our time just sort of caring for one another, then we sort of tips the balance the other way, and likewise go on the other side, which is we do all the function stuff and never actually ask how we're doing. So it is purpose is really key to it all.
Thank you. And I think healthy networks, so I threw that thing up earlier and they were very broad brushstrokes, but for me, healthy networks pay attention to those 3 things. Are we ministering to God together? Are we ministering to each other? And are we ministering to our city, however we define city? And for me, I think a healthy network does those 3 things. And when we lose sight of some of those, or there'll always be a different kind of balance in there, won't there? There'll always be some that are really about nurturing the fellowship amongst ministers, some that are very focused on worship and prayer, and some that are more focused on service. But I would hope that there'd be a blend of those things in a healthy network, and that blend might change from time to time. So in Wolverhampton, we began very much as ministers taking care of ministers. So we met together to pray together and to eat together and just to share what God was doing. That was it. No program, no plan, nothing beyond that. Nobody advertised their stuff, no joint stuff. But it became clear in some of our meetings that God was calling us to do some other things together, and so they flowed out of that. But that was a flowing out of relationship, friendship, worship and prayer, as opposed to we're meeting together to do that stuff, we're meeting and praying to do that stuff. The stuff flowed out after. So, yeah. Go on, Paul, you had your hand up again.
Sorry, I was going to just say, actually, but again, taking that on and understanding a little bit about why our Baptist cluster kind of fell apart is because we could only ever focus on the looking after one another, because we had no mutual city. We had no mutual setting because we were all spread across a fairly wide geographical area. So me talking about rural community and small town didn't really resonate with the large communities with far more church structure within it, etc. And so I actually posed the question to Jonathan. I apologise because actually what happened to the cluster was it became such a mutual support, but it actually became a mutual misery session. And it was I used the phrase one downmanship. You think you got it bad, you should hear about my problems, because that's all it was, because we had no other purpose. We had no common vision of building the kingdom. So actually what we did was destroy our empires, or looked at ourselves as these crumbling places of chaos and confusion. And so it's kind of, you're right, we need to get the balance right. We need to keep in mind those things, and I think it's quite right that our cluster actually fell apart because it would have served no earthly good purpose apart from listening to other people's misery. But what we need to do is build each other up. About encouragement, the thing that came to the beginning, about encouraging one another. I actually put in my question to you, Jonathan, about is setting ground rules a solution? And I think one of the first things is be nice. Whatever you're going to say about your own setting and so on, try and be as nice as possible, particularly if you realise you're the problem, not the solution.
Thank you. I'm going to give you wrap the whole thing up in one phrase in just a moment. That'll be my final phrase. It's on a slide coming up in a moment, but I'm going to go slightly further than be nice, but there we go. Thank you. I think you're absolutely right. And you just need to know that we've all just stolen one downmanship. That's definitely going to appear in a conversation somewhere else soon. So that was a great thought. We've got a couple minutes left. Any final thoughts, questions? David, you're reaching for the button. Is that David Lewis? I don't know.
No, it's just worth naming a couple of the pressures on networking relations at the moment. Churches' resources are dwindling, and there's a tendency to pull in horns when that happens. And also, not so much Baptists, but many of our colleagues in other denominations, whereas they might have been serving one church and now serving half a county, it feels. And the amount of spare energy to build relations with other churches. And that actually puts, I think, a little bit more on the Baptists. You talked earlier about how Baptists have a unique contribution. One of the unique contributions is we are still very locally focused, most of us, whereas some of our colleagues aren't. And we are declining, but compared to some other denominations, we are still relatively healthy. And
Thank you.
Maybe
Well,
the driver
time
as
runs
well.
away. Adrian, go on, Adrian.
I was just going to just to follow up what David was saying there. I'm just thinking of my Methodist colleague here in the town, who is actually also the Methodist minister of 3 other towns, each of which has its own churches together type group. So,
Yeah.
you know, they're in a really difficult position. Which of those do they engage with? Yeah, one or all 3, and it tears them all different directions. So it is important.
Yeah.
You know, often we're not in that position, are we?
No, thank you. Okay, so what bricks for building with? We've talked about that. And here it is, Jonathan's golden rule for building healthy networks. Be generous. Just be generous. And be generous with welcome. Be generous with grace. Be generous with forgiveness. Be generous with resources. Generosity unlocks things in a way that we just never know. You know, there was a church, a Black Pentecostal church in Wolverhampton, who had been renting an old union building, and there was an old bank next door that they'd had their eye on, and they'd been inquiring about, and the bank was £1 million, this building, or just shy of £1 million. And because the building had been vacant for so long, all of a sudden they had a phone call from the people who own that building saying, we just need to dispose of this. It's not selling. We're going to sell it for £300,000. But in order to secure that, you will need to pay a deposit of, and the deposit was, I think, something like £100,000 or £120,000. And they had about a week to come up with this money. And so they were a good sized church, and there was a chance they were going to kind of get there. But when that was shared with our ministers group the following Sunday, after our services and after our offerings in, I guess, 10 or 15 of our churches, we told the congregation that the church, it's called ILC, this is their situation. So you've already given in the offering. This isn't above and beyond that. If you wanted to share in that, then please make a gift. And tomorrow morning, we'll take all of these gifts to a meeting with the pastor. And he didn't know what was happening. We told him that we would just wanted to meet with him in the morning to pray with him about this financial need they have. But when we went into that meeting, the 6 or 7 of us who represented that network, we gave him £14,000. And that was just like a one-off offering. That generosity, which, you know, blew their church away, but then had all kinds of other ripples as people found out about it. Why do we do it? Because we love them and we wanted them to have that building, and it was a unique opportunity. But the outcome of that was incredible. For us as individuals, I want to suggest it always takes somebody to be generous first. And so I want to encourage us in this room now to be the ones that lead in generosity in our local networks. Here, I wanted to create a new network of ministers because nothing was in existence. So I just took everybody out for lunch several times, and now others want to take lunch and want to cook lunch and want to make lunch. But actually, I took us out for lunch several times. Why? Because I'm a big spender? No, because I didn't want the money thing to get in the way of what we really wanted to do. And I think we have resources and money and buildings and all kinds of things. And I want to suggest that generosity, alongside our generosity of welcome, our generosity of prayer, our generosity of thanksgiving, just in all sorts of ways, if we can live with that generosity in heart, will reflect something of God to our colleagues across different denominations, but beyond that then into the localities where we are, in a way that perhaps sees something of what the psalmist was writing about, and we land where we began. I think that generosity is one of the keys here, that then becomes like precious oil poured on the head, that abundance, that soaking as we pour out all that we have for the sake of the God who calls us together. Well, we're there, we're at the end. And David, I'm going to hand back to you.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. I don't think we solved it, but we shared it. And sometimes that's enough, just to be an encouragement that maybe the pressures we're seeing and the tensions we're seeing in our own local area are not unique to our town. And also to explore together sort of some of the real importance of why we do what we do. So if it's okay, I will simply pray for us, and then we'll have lunch, probably, if you're anything like me. Let's pray, shall we? Father, thank you for our sisters and brothers who do not describe themselves as Baptist, but then nobody's perfect. But they are disciples and followers of you in our towns. So thank you for them. Thank you for the way that they follow with integrity, they follow integrity, their own path of discipleship, even when it's slightly different to ours. And Lord, help us to fulfill that prayer that you made in John 17, that we might be one and that we might give ourselves for and to one another. So help us to build healthy networks, healthy relations, and ultimately a healthy kingdom in our town. Amen.